Good evening and welcome to our third presentation of the year. I'm Brent Taylor, the convener of the Speaker Program for Military History and Heritage Victoria. On behalf of our committee, I welcome you to tonight's Zoom event. And tonight we're pleased to have Don Farrands presenting Courage and Compassion, a stretcher bearer's journey from no man's land and beyond. Now, a little about Don. He's a commercial barrister, chartered accountant and company director. He has significant and varied experience in law, commerce, the arts and community organisations, including the disability sector. He lives in Melbourne and he is the grandson of N.H. Ferguson, the subject of this book. Now, a little bit of process before Don begins. He'll be answering questions at the end of the presentation. We can do this in two ways. In the past, I've had people putting up chat messages, and I've been quite strict about that. If you wanted to use that method this time, just put a chat message in addressed to everybody, and when the time comes, I'll ask the question with your first name. Or we'll go informal and you can wait and put your hand up during question time, and I'll invite you to ask your question verbally. So whichever way you prefer. Don's happy to have screens on, but remember that everyone can also see you. Jason will turn the microphones off, but please leave them off. And now you should be on speaker view, and I will invite Don to speak, please.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Can everyone hear me well? All good. Okay, I'm going to share screen and put up some slides that I'll be using. Can everybody see that? Yes? Brent, can you say yes?
Okay. Yes, I can.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining for this evening. This is a tremendous pleasure for me to speak to you all. And I wish to thank Brent, of course, in particular for facilitating this on behalf of the Military History and Heritage Victoria Association. Today I'm speaking about my book, Courage and Compassion, which you can see on the screen, which is, as Brent said, a story about my grandfather. It is correct to say that there has been a previous version of this book called The Glass Soldier, which some of you may have seen. And last year, my publishers became international, and they rebranded this book as Courage and Compassion. And if you're in Germany or Europe or America or England, you can buy this book. So in any event, it's available at major booksellers and over the internet on Booktopia, Big Sky Publishing, and Angus and Robertson, and so on. And Jason's going to put up a link later for those details, together with a CD of the music to this book called The Glass Soldier Suite by Nigel Westlake. I'll mention that again in a moment. Anyway, let me turn to the book, and before doing so, I should thank the reviewers in the book, within the book, Barry Jones, AO, Julian Burnside, you'd know him, Philip Adams, Nigel Westlake, Natasha Stott-Despoja, whose grandfather was in the Great War as well, Gabby Hollows from the Fred Hollows Foundation, and Derek Gill. Does everybody know Derek Gill from ABC Radio? Yeah. Okay. So this book was in part inspired because the Melbourne Theatre Company put on a play called The Glass Soldier, which was about my grandfather, after I had shown the playwright Hanny Rayson the war diaries of my grandfather, and I'll be showing you some of those war diaries later. And similarly, the suite by Nigel Westlake was composed after the composer was asked to consider looking at the story of the Glass Soldier. And I've just got a few bars to play you, if that's okay, of the main theme from that suite. See if I can get that to go. And you'll hear this come on, I think. Let's see. Here we go. And when you're listening to this, it's supposed to inspire the story of a humble soldier in battle as a stretcher bearer. And the main theme is of a trumpet which is about to come in. And my grandfather was a cornet player in the military band. And here comes the brass. So that gives you a sense of the sentiment of this story. My book is a historical narrative, so it's a story told based on the history of my grandfather, but with reference to the Great War. And when you think about writing a book about a soldier, you have to, of course, think about placing that soldier in all of the battles that he was in, and then placing those battles in the context of where the war was up to, and then placing where the war was up to in relation to all the countries involved. So it's actually quite a complex intellectual and emotional exercise to record the life of a simple, humble soldier stretcher bearing in the Great War. So who was this soldier, and why is his story important? You may have seen in the blurb that it's a story that stirs souls, and I think you'll find that that is the case as I take you through his story. Nelson Ferguson, who was my grandfather, who I call Nelson in the book, he was a young art teacher and musician, cornet player, when he volunteered for the Great War in July 1915. And there was a great drive, as you all know, for young men to volunteer. And the nation was very, very successful at doing that because virtually all the young men volunteered. And we know that there was quite a bit of action resulting from that. And that gave rise to virtually all the young men, certainly in Victoria, being sent to war. And there was, of course, enormous outpouring at the end of the war and later because of the impact of the war on Victoria and the nation. And this is a photo of the War Memorial, sorry, the Shrine of Remembrance in Victoria on the day of its opening. And it's said that basically 1 in 3 Victorians turned up to this event. But of course, here's the image taken last year of the magnificent shrine. And basically, here's a photo of the Melbourne Villa Brittano Brass Ensemble, which I chair, and we play pieces from the First World War, essentially. Now, although the nation was quite new, or was brand new in 1901, Australia remained part of the British Empire, of course. So when Nelson went to war, he was still a British subject, even though the Commonwealth had been federated. And he remained a British subject until his death. Now, you may not accept this fact, but we were all British subjects until 1986, 1986, when the Australia Act was passed. In any event, everybody gave their all, and they were invited to participate. Now, this is quite an incredible photo of the nurses going down Collins Street. Has anyone seen that photo before? Here you can see the Australian flag on the Melbourne Town Hall. That's a joke. As everybody lines up to volunteer. And we know that there were truly staggering responses to going to war. In fact, a lot of young Australians were keen to go, and that by around April 1916, 233,000 sons had been wrenched from parents, wives, lovers, answering the call of country to fight the Empire's distant battles. And by the end of the war, that number had doubled to around 460,000. Now, every section of society gave, and I mean every section. The school children raised money selling sweets. The Victorian Bar that I'm a part of gave an ambulance. Chalk was rationed in Victorian schools, and farmers gave around 500,000 sheepskins to keep frozen soldiers warm. In essence, Australia gave everything. It sold its entire wool clip 3 years forward to Britain so that Germany couldn't buy Australian wool. This was a truly staggering contribution to the war effort by this infant nation. And by late 1916, my grandfather was not only had been trained as a stretcher bearer in London, but had been shipped over to the Somme and was a stretcher bearing on the Somme from late 1916 and in the thick of it, that is in the Somme battle, stretcher bearing. Now, you might be asking me, why was he a stretcher bearer instead of an infantryman? And the answer is that historically, if you were in a brass band, you were going to go into the medical corps. Now, why was that? What's the connection between a brass band and a medical corps? And the answer is those people who were in brass bands could probably read, as in read music, and were probably educated. And so they were more likely to be medically able to learn medical procedures than people who were not educated. So there was this very significant relationship between brass band members and stretcher bearers and medical officers and so on. The history of stretcher bearing is itself an incredible history. There's a dedicated book on stretcher bearing in Australia, you may know, by Mark Johnson, and that's a great read if you're interested in the history of stretcher bearing, which essentially goes back to the Napoleonic days. Prior to Napoleon, essentially if you were damaged or injured in a battle, you were just left there. They didn't have the notion of picking you up and trying to fix you, because essentially there was no medicine and there was the only rudimentary surgery. So you were just left on the battlefield. But after Napoleon, they used to think, well, maybe we better pick them up and try and care for them. And by 1915 onwards, of course, the stretcher bearing unit was a fully functional unit. And Nelson Ferguson, the image you see here, he had received quite a bit of medical training in London. So, for example, he knew how to do a splint. He knew how to stop a bleed. He knew basic medical procedures. And he would, of course, go out into pitch battle, pick up the damaged soldiers and take them back to the dressing stations and so on. So I've got a couple of images here. This is one of him. He took on his box brownie camera, which was illegal. It was illegal to take photos, and there he is on the left there. You can see his ambulance badge or his medical badge on his sleeve there. Now, of course, the cross that was on the sleeve meant that they could be picked out quite readily by the enemy, and was quite an attractive idea for the enemy to shoot stretcher bearers, because that's very debilitating from a morale perspective. And if you can knock over all the stretcher bearers, you're going to encourage the enemy to think that they're not going to be rescued if they're injured. So stretcher bearers had an extremely dangerous run in battle, because they were always being picked off. Here he is in a sunken road, and you can see that it's pretty war-torn, and he looks like he's already had a pretty rough go. Now, my grandfather saw 4 major battles. This photo is to give you the impression of the kinds of battles he entered into. This is a stockpile of disused cartridges, and literally millions of shells and bullets rained down on young men. And the idea was to obliterate as many men as you could and their trenches. And this gives you a sense of the scale of attrition. It was literally industrial-sized violence for the first time in humanity. Until World War I, battles had been relatively major, but they hadn't worked themselves up into wholesale industrial violence. And this was the sort of violence that my grandfather had been put into. There's another image of the spent cartridges as each side tries to obliterate as many young men as they can. This work of stretcher bearing, despite all this, was carried out by my grandfather at Bullecourt in France in early 1917, then at Ypres in Belgium, 1917, including he was at the Battle of Passchendaele, and then at Villers-Bretonneux in northern France, which, as you know, the battle was in April 1918. Now, like many soldiers, my grandfather carried a diary, and here is one element of it. You can see at the top there, the safety pin, the large safety pin. It enables him to put this humble booklet pinned into his trench coat so that he can keep it despite being in battle or despite being on the battlefield. And you can see it says N.H. Ferguson, and then it has his address, Ballarat, Peel Street, Ballarat. And on the other side of this document, it says, "Please return this to Peel Street should it be found on my body." Now, my grandfather was, as I mentioned, an art teacher in Ballarat before he went to the war. And so, of course, he took his paints and his drawings and so on. And here's one that he took. I've got a copy of this because he posted it back home. And you can see it's a pretty humble sketch on watercolor, and it's in France. And on the back of it, it says, and I'm going to read it because it's hard to read, "Second attempt at sunset behind a broken wood. We got to carry just as I got this far. Therefore, I couldn't put the barbed wire and the stakes to make the foreground more interesting. The evenings here are glorious, but just as they faded out, the strife opened up. So there he is. He's in a trench and he's doing that watercolor, and the strife opens up, so he can't finish the job. That little drawing goes into a biscuit tin and then gets posted back to Australia, which is how I got it. Here, let me show you some more sketches that he took in the trenches. So this is a little naive drawing in charcoal, divisional headquarters in winter. And you can see he has quite a deft hand. He's a talented young man. And you can see all the trees are busted because of the shelling and so on. This is a very beautiful image, which is on the inside cover of my book. And you can see the priest at the top there. Can everybody see the priest holding up his hand? See that? And on the right-hand side, there are some soldiers, and then there's a burial going on at the back of the image. And I don't know about you folks, but for my part, that's a very moving image. All done on the back of a piece of paper in warfare. Now, this photo is to take you back 100 years to the trauma of war. Can anybody recognize that photo? Anybody seen that photo before? It's quite a famous image of the Menin Road at Ypres in Belgium, where a huge battle was raging up the end of this road in 1917. And I can assure you as a fact, because I know it from his diary, that my grandfather was on this road on the day this photo was taken. His diary records he and his mate Pomp, who features heavily in my book, carrying men up and down this road as they had done in earlier battles. And some of the images of stretcher bearers, you would have seen that image before. It's quite a famous image of stretcher bearers taking soldiers back. And you can see an image to the right-hand side at the back. It appears to be a German soldier. Do you see that? With a German helmet. And they quite often had the enemy stretcher bearing as well, as assisting generally once they'd been captured. But you can see the stretcher bearer in the middle there attending to somebody. And similarly, this is an image of a trench warfare, of course, with the machine guns. And you can get a sense of the bedlam that my grandfather would have been in. And this is the image close to where that previous image was. And you can see the men are being taken out of the line because they're damaged. Now, all of this work is horrendous work, but of course, the added difficulty in World War I was that there was wholesale use of gas, including mustard gas. And tracing the history of the use of gas itself is a fascinating part of World War I. And there are books written about that. There's a book written called Mustard Gas. In any event, I'm not sure if many of you know, but the use of gas was actually prohibited from about 1890 under an international convention, but nobody seemed to bother with that in World War I, and they all started gassing each other endlessly. The Germans used it very extensively, but the Americans also used it. And at one point, at least, the British used it. I'm pleased to say the Australians never used it. In any event, in early April 1918, most of the Allies got together under the initiative of the Red Cross, and they sought to agree that, well, maybe we shouldn't be using this gassing weapon because we're maiming all these young men permanently and killing them, and it really is a horrendous crime against humanity. And the Red Cross said, you've got to stop doing it. And all of the nations agreed, even Germany agreed, and there was only one nation that wouldn't agree, and there was only one man who stopped the prohibition on gas. And who do you think that was? That was Winston Churchill. He said, well, no, the wind's prevailing in favour of the Allies on the Western Front, so we should continue using it. So as a consequence, in April 1918, everybody started using mustard gas. My grandfather happened to be at Villa Bretonneux in April 1918 when the mustard gas started being used again. He was stretcher bearing just outside the town of Villa Bretonneux. Now, the genius of mustard gas is that it lies low in the field, and unless the wind whips it up, the soldiers don't know it's there. So the soldiers come into the field, it's all quiet, the wind picks up, and then they all fall over. So the soldiers and the stretcher bearers have to wear their anti-mustard gas masks all the time because they don't know when the wind will shift. On this particular day, which was 17 April 1918, my grandfather was stretcher bearing around the town, and he was ordered to take his gas mask off. All the stretcher bearers were, because they were not stretcher bearing well. They'd been doing it for hours. So they took it off, and as soon as they took it off, the wind picked up and they were all gassed, including my grandfather. And the Germans had sent over 5,000 mustard gas shells very effectively. And their idea was to disengage as many soldiers as you could by maiming them temporarily or permanently, or killing them by gassing them. And so my grandfather was gassed in the eyes and the lungs, and his fingers tore at his eyes, his chest heaved, and he became disabled. In the aviary of the town's chateau, where Nelson had been staying, birds dropped, asphyxiated by the gas. He'd been doing this sort of work in all this sort of rubble, and now he'd been blinded and gassed in the lungs, and he was sitting in a field. This is a photo taken just outside of Villa Bretonneux, not long after my grandfather was gassed at Villa Bretonneux. Now, when you get gassed and blinded by mustard gas, they pour certain chemicals into your eyes, and then they bind your eyes, as you can see in this image. But you're pretty useless to the army, so you need to be taken back to dressing stations and to hospitals. So my grandfather was taken back to London Hospital, and his eyes didn't come good. If they had been, they would have put him back into battle. By this time in the war, mid-1918, about a third of all soldiers who were damaged were put back into battle. That's how short they were on numbers. But my grandfather couldn't come good, so he was sent back to Australia, evacuated with Nelson. And as an aside, I should tell you that when he got to Sorrento, of course, the Spanish flu had broken out, so he had to stay on the boat for 2 weeks, bobbing up and down off the coast of Sorrento in Port Phillip Bay as part of the process for trying to keep the flu out of Melbourne. In any event, he came back, his eyes were super damaged, his lungs were damaged, and the question arose, what is a young man, Nelson Ferguson, what's supposed to happen to him? I'm going to tell you what happens to him. When soldiers come back, the federal government said, oh, well, we better try and train you up. So if you were a plumber, they'd try and put you back to plumbing. If you were an art teacher, they'd try and put you back to teaching. And they put Nelson Ferguson back to art teaching, even though his eyes were heavily damaged. His corneas had been pocked by the gas. The whole nation had, by this time, had been tipped upside down, of course. Imagine today if 80% of the young men went away and 2 years later came back and they were all broken. What impact would that have on Australian society? Well, that's what was happening back then. And in any event, he was put back to the Workmen's College in Melbourne, which you may know is now RMIT. And he was, despite having damaged eyes, he became an art teacher there. He met Madeline, my grandmother, who was working in a photography studio, and they had children. Now, despite being heavily disabled, he was able to have a successful career as a disabled art teacher. But by the early 1950s, his eyes were shot, completely shot, and RMIT retrenched him. By this time, he had 3 children. One, of course, was my mother. And he had a son, John Ferguson, who had become very interested in stained glass windows. And he and his John Ferguson and his brother-in-law opened a stained glass window making workshop in the backyard of my grandfather's house in Carnegie. And they started building these incredible windows all across Victoria and putting them into churches. At this stage, my grandfather was making the tea, assisting where he could, and being what my uncles described as the spirit of the windows. He was the old man, the old wise mentor, the disabled veteran. Now, in 1962, in the mail, my grandfather got this. Can everybody see that? This is from the repatriation department, Nelson Harold Ferguson, 6 Calmer Avenue, East Malvern, entitled to treatment for scarring of the cornea. So what happened was, out of the blue, he gets this entitlement card from the Commonwealth saying, well, we will pay for an operation on your eyes. Now, remember, he got gassed in 1918, and this thing turns up in 1962. In any event, he takes the entitlement card and the government pays for him to go and see an ophthalmologist. The ophthalmologist looks at his eyes and says, "They're all shot. We can't do anything. You're an old man. I can't recommend the operation." So he continues working in the stained glass window factory. But in 1969, he gets reassessed by a different ophthalmologist at the suggestion of the government. And this time, it's Mr. Hardy Smith, who'd been training in London. And he says, "You should give the operation a go." So we're now the distance between 1918 and 1969. Nelson goes into the Heidelberg Repatriation Hospital. He has a corneal transplant. He spends 6 weeks in hospital. When the surgeon thinks the eye should be assessed, he decides it's time to undo the bandages. Now, in those days, when you got your corneas replaced, they had to be hand sewn on. And the mechanism was to have the finest thread, take the old cornea out, have the finest thread, and literally hand sew them around the eye. The surgeon, after these weeks, comes back, unwinds the bandages to check the 77-year-old veteran. He looks into the eyes and he sees the atrocity of war. Mustard gas has been defeated, conquered by the miracle of science, the profound resilience of an old veteran, love of family, and the surgeon's brilliance, and my grandfather can see again. This was the work of Mr. Hardy Smith in Melbourne to restore an old Anzac's life. My grandmother, Madeline, had died 2 weeks earlier. Her contribution, which I outline in the book, was immense, not only to the Ferguson family, but I pay tribute in the book to the immense contribution of all of the women who looked after those damaged soldiers. When you think about it, the role of women in the 20th century to restore Australia and build it into a great nation cannot be overstated. These were the women who cared for a whole generation of heavily damaged men. These were the women who raised the children. These were the women who cared for weeping soldiers. My grandfather was heavily traumatized emotionally by the Great War, and my mother recounts that he would often have another night in the trenches, and Madeline was the one that managed all that. So Nelson was ultimately able to uplift himself into a refreshed new life, a fully seeing life after 77 years. He could see the nails on the veranda, the back of the veranda. He could see the grass dancing. And he went and saw the windows in these magnificent church windows that the son and son-in-law had built with his help. And now, generations forward, the grandchildren make those windows, And they made a window in Soldiers Hill Church in Ballarat. And this is the window you're looking at. I was blind, but now I see. From John 9:25. And I reproduced that in the book. And in Courage and Compassion, there's a whole section of images and photos and artwork in the middle of the book, which is quite beautiful. This is the entire image in that church, built in the old factory. Spawned, initiated by Nelson Ferguson, the young art teacher who became disabled. And there's a whole list of churches in the back of my book where the magnificent windows were made and put in. Now, as one of the symbols of society, of course, Nelson Ferguson's tree sits in the Avenue of Honour at Ballarat. There he is, 15th Field Ambulance, planted in about 1922, and now fully grown and matured. Think about it, just put into your mind the image of the Avenue of Honour and this tree. The mature, still, wise old tree, as was this veteran, still contributing, still being proud in that Avenue of Honour. And it is a magnificent thing to drive down to those avenues of honour. And his is right at the very end. It's now around 97 years old, and it's still growing strong. And I think it's a very beautiful symbol. So why is this story that I've taken you through, why is this important? Well, my book seeks to answer or deal with a whole bunch of themes. One is Australia's relationship to Britain through the 20th century. And when you think about it, the Commonwealth came about as a schedule to an act of the British Parliament. We were born out of the British Parliament. And when we went to war, we were just an infant nation. When the parents said, how many men can you send over? We said pretty much everybody. When the parents said, by the way, can you rustle up some Indigenous people to contribute as well? We went round and collected them up as well. We gave our entire economy to the war. And it wasn't until 1986 that we cut the umbilical cord. I also deal with the role of God and war in this book. War touched religion and vice versa in the strangest ways. Soldiers relied on their religious beliefs, of course. But in the paranoia of war, anything can be rationalised, and the high point of that was that the German Synod Church, in the middle of the war, melted 10,000 church bells to make military guns and kill young men. Another theme in my book is the role, of course, of mateship, and that figures quite a bit. The mateship of Nelson and Pomp was forged in war, but sustained by their love of peace, and they carried that out, that love of peace, all through the rest of their lives. Another theme in my book is the role of government and the accountability of the community to care for returned soldiers. Now, we're going through, as you know, a royal commission into veteran suicide at the moment. And it is a foundational proposition of any decent society that those who go and put their life at risk to protect others should be given the highest possible protection themselves. You saw that today in my presentation when the Commonwealth provided Nelson with his entitlement card, despite the fact that it was 50 years after he'd been damaged. And that perpetuity is a necessary incident of any civilized society. Anything that can be done for our veterans must be done. The next theme I explore, which is probably a primary theme, is the notion of virtue. And it's a fascinating word, virtue, because it comes from the Roman word virtus. Now, virtus was the notion of honour, courage, and duty, but not only as a soldier, but also as a citizen. And one of the duties as a citizen was to relay the importance of good character to the next generation. Now, do we see a lot of that today? I don't think so. In substance, the book is about moral excellence. You can be humble and you can play a relatively elementary role in war or in society. But if you have moral excellence, you're making a very big contribution. And that is the story of my grandfather. The providence which flowed from his excellence, you've seen today. From stretcher bearing to love of family, and all despite disability, and doing it with grace. What a profound human being he was. To receive the joy of sight for a second time and receive that with grace as well made him a special person. I reference in the middle of my book a speech in the British Parliament where an admiral said, once it's known you're fighting for the right, you can't be defeated because righteousness is immortal. Moral excellence ought to be immortal in my view as well, and we ought to honour the soldiers who have behaved honourably and contributed back despite disability. I am a strong believer that not all of them shall die because the contributions they make live on into a modern, civilised, prosperous, peaceful society. And we need to reflect on that continuously. And I think the Shrine does that beautifully. I want to thank you all for listening carefully to this story and its messages. And I want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to share it with you. And I want to thank the association for the great work it does in keeping the interest of its members alive to the fascinating elements of military history. And I wish to also thank Brent for inviting me to speak. And it's been a great pleasure to do so.
Thank you very much, Don, for that great presentation. Could you turn your slide show off and I can see we haven't quite finished that.
It's okay, I'll do that.
Well, you can leave it on. If you've got more slides, you can tell us about them.
But that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay. It's great. Thank you. Now, I can see there's no one put a chat message up for me, so I assume that anyone wants to ask questions will be happy to put their hand up and I will ask them. Just to kick it off, Don, how did you come across the War Diaries?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thanks. My mother told me that my auntie had war diaries which she was going to put on the rosebud tip, and did I think that should happen? I said that was probably a bad idea. So I got them and read them, and as a consequence thought they were significant, and so kept them. And I've still got them, although they're about to go to the Australian War Memorial and be put into safekeeping in that way.
Any other questions? Having heard this, I'm curious to know what he did in the glass manufacturing business. Clearly, he wouldn't have been able to assemble or cut glass.
No, he was able to see for some period of it the images and so the what they call the cartoons, and he was able to go out on the job with the boys and assist them in that way. But he obviously didn't make the windows himself because he was legally blind. So yes, his contribution was a coaching, supporting role and assisting where he could. And that was, according to my uncles, an extremely significant role for them.
Okay.
Mark, good to see you.
Thanks, Don. Terrific presentation. Thank you, and I'm keen to get hold of your book. I'm wondering, given the notion of virtue that you up for us, honour, courage, duty, and your reflections on moral excellence for someone who served faithfully as a stretcher bearer. I'm wondering, did your grandfather have faith himself? Do you know whether he was a person who had a sense of God in his life, or connections with the stained glass windows and all that good stuff? And quoting John's Gospel for us at chapter 9, verse 25. I happen to be a chaplain, having served in Army and continuing with Army cadets.
Yes, so I can answer that. It's a great question. Thank you so much. I believe he was a man of faith, and I say that because he carried his Bible in his trench coat through the entire war, and he did go to church after the war. He also, according to my mother, walked on Anzac Day walks and regarded that as a religious experience. But more profoundly, Mark, can I mention this to you? Or not more profoundly, but as an essential part of the answer to your great question. I got his Bible, and you might say to yourself, what part of his Bible was marked? There's only one passage that's marked, and that is the parable of the mustard seed, and I'll read it to you. The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all seeds, but when it is grown, it is the greatest among herbs, and becometh a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in its branches. So here we have the metaphor of starting small and humble and ending in the glory of a full tree with the birds being released. And I think that is just such a perfect example of the man's life, and that is the only passage that he marked. And it just says so much. Do you agree?
For sure. Thanks, Don. I think it was going to be a toss-up between that and the Good Samaritan, but
Yeah, that's right. I didn't know the significance of the parable of the mustard seed until I saw that marking and researched it. But it's a very beautiful passage.
Thank you.
There is, in my bookmark, I just got to finish this, there is a line in there that I don't think anybody would ever spot, but perhaps except for your good self. And it's a passage, it's a part of the book near the end where Nelson and his son are sitting under a fig tree, and there was a fig tree in their backyard. And there's a reference. They were both extremely well educated in biblical matters because they were obviously building windows for that purposes. So, and John says to Nelson, after they were looking at the tree, I saw one of the fig's buddings some time ago and knew the summer was near, which is a passage from the Bible. So yeah, there are biblical references throughout the book. And as I say, I touch on the notion of religion, God, and how that translates in the notion of industrial scale violence. And it is such a fascinating topic and difficult issue to reconcile, but I endeavour it, Mark.
Thanks, Don.
Brent, I wonder if I could ask a question or make a comment.
Sure.
David is my name. Don, first of all, thank you for your very inspiring talk. I guess the theme of my comment is serendipity. In the 1980s, I was very keen on collecting Australian contemporary art. And I followed a group called the Raw Artists, who were based in an old factory in Brunswick Street, Fitzroy.
I've been in that factory.
And you know what I'm going on to say. And two of the Raw artists were Andrew and Peter Ferguson, whom I admired greatly, not simply because of their artwork, but because of their character. They were both very gentle, empathetic, sensitive people. And the man you've described in your talk today, I can see in them. So, you know, it's like the full circle.
It's a lovely thing to say, and thank you for raising that. And you saw that image they'd built of I was blind, but now I see. And that's those two boys receiving the messages from their grandfather.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
There's one comment and question come in on the chat from D. Wood. Very impressed by the summary of thoughts on virtue and moral excellence, but also the question being, what was the percentage of sight restoration from his operation?
So he went from virtually no sight. I think one eye had 1%, the other eye had 3%. And I set all the medical facts out in the book. You know, today we have 20/20 vision, but in those days it was something like 20 feet. The measure of your sight was a fresh set of parameters. But in any event, after the operation, he pretty much had normal sight. The cornea it's well documented, and there are books on it, that the men that came back who'd been gassed and blinded by the mustard gas, the cornea pox insignificantly in some cases from 1918, but as they get older, all of them develop very severe pocking. The pocking deepens, so that by about the late 50s and the 60s, your cornea is essentially completely damaged. And so when you look through the eye, excuse me, you can only see a complete blur. It's called legally blind, as if the camera had gone to a complete blur. And so there were quite a few men who went through the Heidelberg Repatriation Hospital in the mid-60s where this operation was attempted. Now, of course, to replace the cornea, you have to have a cornea that's sitting there ready to go. And so in the 1960s, well, certainly for my grandfather, you have to wait for a car accident or some death, and they take the cornea off somebody and put them onto the soldier. And if it takes well, then it essentially restores your sight fully. And because the cornea is an organ of the body, if it takes well, it'll just it'll just stay on the eye, and he had marvelous eyesight for the rest of his life. I should tell you as an aside that after he got his sight back, he painted a painting for the surgeon, Mr. Hardy Smith. And when the Melbourne Theatre Company announced they would tell this story, Mr. Hardy Smith contacted me and gave me that picture, which I thought was very lovely of him to do.
Tremendous. Now, are there any more questions?
Yes, Mark.
Sorry, I'll go again if nobody else has got anything else. Have you visited Heidelberg Repat yourself, Don? Have you wandered around out there and connected with the Veterans Liaison Officer in situ? I was at Heidelberg Repat this morning, working out at the Kokoda gym.
Oh, wow. Well, if you could find a way for me to get in and do that, Mark, I'd be delighted, because the answer is no, I haven't done it. And I've driven past it, but I haven't been in there. And that would be a great privilege for me to do that.
Let's make that happen for sure.
Excellent. Thank you.
Michael, you need to turn your mic on.
Got it. Okay. Donald, thank you very much. I was most impressed with that.
Thanks very much, Michael.
Of course, I haven't read the book yet, but I'm now quite determined to do so, particularly because I was taken with the way in which you appear to have blended a story about an individual or a number of individuals with some very important themes, of the themes of virtue and the themes of moral excellence and God, and drawn that into a way of looking at what might otherwise just be a military history.
Yes.
A military history narrative. You've drawn the narrative, but also explored the themes that come out. And I think that that's something I'm looking forward to reading.
Oh, good. Yeah, you'll see it completely all through the book, even though you're reading a story about a man doing things. You'll see all those themes pop in and out, including, for example, I believe it's not war that's episodic, it's peace that's episodic. And there's a permanent undercurrent of war that we have to live with, and we can stamp it out every now and then, but it'll pop up, and we've seen that this year, haven't we?
Oh, indeed, yes.
And so when you're reading this, I hope very interesting story, and it has quite a lot of historical fact in it, these themes hopefully come into your mind constantly as you're reading. I have laboured hard in the book, so I might have probably read 50 books to distill this story down. And as I said at the outset, if you try and trace one soldier, into Europe and follow all the battles and try and make it cogent and readily followable. It's quite a difficult job, even for a humble barrister. And then to overlay that story with the themes is a challenge, but I'd be privileged to hear any feedback, Michael, as to whether or not you think I've done that adequately.
I will certainly read it with great interest.
I'm sure that you will find this. There's a couple of comments one from Marcus saying, curiously, a lot of stained glass windows at Heidelberg Repat Hospital. And Graham Miller says there's one stained glass window at the Shrine. So there.
Yes, I didn't know that. I know that they were commissioned a lot of, after the war, stained glass window making became very popular because there were all these dedications and memorial things. And it was actually, it sounds horrible, but there was a boom in business after the First World War and the Second World War as people dedicated their windows to their relatives. And it doesn't surprise me, therefore, that the windows that you've mentioned exist. One of the things I wanted to mention before finishing up is the war diaries figure very heavily in about the first third of the book. And so you'll get to read his entries quite regularly. For example, he gets trench rot in his feet, and they have to put whale oil on to get him back out stretcher bearing. And I show the entries in his diary about all that. So you will get to know and see the man in action. That part of the book's pretty heavy going, but I encourage everybody to push through because there's all that light and joy and love in the second half of the book.
I think we'll wind up now. It's been a tremendous presentation. Thank you, Don. And I see you've generated a huge amount of interest. I hope the sales go up for you.
That's good. Thank you. The royalties go to the Fred Hollows Foundation. So far, funded about 500 eye operations.
Oh, excellent. Very well. Very good. So I will, oh, hang on. There's another comment here that's a bit long to read from John Keir. Thank you very much for telling the story of your grandfather, and thank you for a wonderful acknowledgement of your grandmother and so many other women who cared and supported for their returned and war-damaged men after the war. That was actually particularly poignant for me. That was very much the story of my family too. That contribution is not always put front and centre. Thank you again. John Keir, I too am a grandson of an Australian FWW Australian stretcher bearer.
Oh, wow, fantastic. Okay.
So thank you very much. It's obviously hit a very fertile patch in our audience. And in the next couple of days, we're going to be sending out another 3-minute survey, and I'm sure that will show that Don has done an excellent presentation, but please fill it out. We always do that and make sure that we understand how we're going along.
That's great. And if you have any feedback, I'm on the Victorian Bar website. You can contact me by email. I'd be delighted to hear from you. But it's been a great pleasure, Brent, to speak to your colleagues, and so grateful that you've given me this opportunity.
Right, and thank you for coming. And the other point that I'll make is that Jason will be sending out relevant information about how to buy the book and various contact details. So that'll be coming out shortly. I'd also like to remind you of our one-day conference, the Bloody Beachheads, the Battle of Goanna, Buna and Sanananda. I think I might have got it this time. Was postponed because of COVID. It's been pushed out to Saturday, the 12th of November. Tickets are on sale, that's at the 80th anniversary. We've shifted the venue. It's now East Melbourne RSL Stanley, I think it's Grove, not Grove. Stanley Groves Drive. Oh, that's a strange one. Malvern East, Victoria. So look for information and registration on our website. And this brings our evening session to a close. Thank you again, Don, very much. Thanks to Jason, who keeps this going from behind scenes, and thank you all for joining us. I meant to say I haven't organised a speaker for next time, and around mid to late August, but I'm working on it, and you'll know about it as soon as I know about it. So let's stay posted, and I hope to see you again. So good night to you from the committee and myself.
Good night.
Cheers.